To the Point with Michael Williams.
Bounded by the Atlantic Ocean and on our west, Lake Okeechobee, so much of our lifestyle and our economy revolves around our water. How are the conditions? Can we expect algae or red tide in the summer or beyond? How can marine life help us and give us early warning signs about our human health? Good morning and welcome. As part of our year-long Protecting Paradise focus, we decided to devote our entire To the Point broadcast today to water issues affecting our area. And joining me is Jim Sullivan, Executive Director of Florida Atlantic University's Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute in Fort Pierce. We thank you so much for coming in.
Oh, thank you for having me here.
You all have established a national reputation in terms of your expertise. Let's bring it home. Give me an overview as we look at water issues. Of course, first and foremost, we think about algae, the toxic algae crisis, the ongoing debate about its human health impacts potentially, with Lake Okeechobee at the heart of it all. Give us your overview, your perspective to begin.
Right now, Florida is going through an ecological and an economic crisis with harmful algal blooms. They are dispersed throughout the state right now. We have the Florida red tide on the west coast, which affected the east coast this past year. We have the blue-green algae blooms in Lake Okeechobee, which affect both coasts during lake discharges. We have sporadic blooms in the Indian River Lagoon. We have brown tide, several other species that are growing right now. It's not just one thing. The state itself is being inundated with harmful algal blooms right now across pretty much all the different waterways. So it's a serious problem we have to address.
Just how harmful may they be? We continue to hear reports coming out every day about the potential human health impact.
The interesting thing is each one of these is a different type of algae, which means each one can potentially do a different damage both to human health and the environment. They all make different toxins. So, for example, the blue-green algae make what's called a hepatotoxin, microcystin. This can destroy your liver if you're exposed to enough of it. Florida's red tide creates a toxin called brevetoxin, which when you breathe, you'll cough. It'll irritate your breathing, but it's also a neurotoxin. It can actually affect your brain chemistry. Brown tide is not toxic, yet it can cause massive fish kills because it strips the oxygen out of the water. So each one of them is kind of unique, and we have to deal with them all separately.
Offer perspective and context as you do so well. I can hear people at home right now saying, oh my gosh, that's scaring me to death. Perspective. It doesn't mean that if you've been exposed, you're necessarily going to end up ever having these issues, but it is the potential for long-term exposure that can lead to this. Give us a little more context on that.
Yeah, and I don't mean to scare anyone. I mean, the algae is out there. It can be toxic, but whether you ever get an exposure that affects your health at all, that's something that we actually need to do research on to find out what chronic exposure actually does to people. We don't know a lot about that. Acute exposure, generally your body will tell you, oh, I'm being exposed to toxin, you're going to back away from it. Like when red tide happens and you go to the beach and start coughing, you're going to leave the beach. Your body will protect you.
But it's exactly that kind of nuanced long-term work that is part of the mission statement of FAU Harbor Branch, to give us answers that we need, to make sure that none of us are sticking our heads in the sand and that we're looking at these potentials for long-term health impacts.
Exactly, and what we want to do is do the research that we can actually assess what the risk is to our human population. Without that kind of long-term research and dedication to doing it, I can't tell you what the actual risk is. The risk may be minimal. I mean, it may not be that big of a deal, but it could be a big deal.
And we need to be looking at it with all hands on deck.
We do, because as I said, Florida is on the front lines of this problem right now.
It's very easy for us in the media to talk about toxic algae blooms, red tide, and forget to talk a little bit more about sources and causes of both. Give us a little primer on that before we move ahead on what we may see this summer and some of the proactive work you're doing. But first, sources and causes.
Well, the easy way to think about this is all algae are what we call phytoplankton. They're basically just simple plants. They need three things, just like your common house plant at home. They need light. The more light they get, the better they grow. They need warm temperatures. The warmer it is, the faster they can grow. And they need nutrients. Nutrients being nitrogen, phosphorus, different things, just like you'd fertilize your lawn or you fertilize crops. Algae are simple plants, and that's all it takes for them to grow.
And in Florida, with the enormous growth, with agriculture, with coastal homes putting fertilizer on yards, it provides the perfect pollutant nutrient mix for for exactly what you described.
Right, and it's really, you know, of the three things that could control these harmful algal blooms, we can only control one of them. We can only stop nutrient pollution. We're not going to turn off the sun. This is the Sunshine State, and Florida's warm, so we're not going to stop that.
Based on the kind of research and work you do, can we do a lot more? People sometimes tend to throw up their hands. The problem's too big, but there's a lot more we can do with research helping lead the way to impact factor number 3, the nutrient runoff, the pollution runoff that all of us have a piece of causing.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of the counties, especially on this coast, they're doing a really good job, and they're working on it as best they can. There are many different ways to attack this problem. You can do septic to sewer conversions, you can control biosolids being spread through agriculture, you can stop residential fertilizer application during the rainy season. All these things are actually being done right now, and they will pay off.
I want to begin to tie it into the important work you're doing a little more directly. Before we go to that, the fear, of course, always with summer not far away is of another potential for toxic algae bloom, red tide. Give us your sense of that. The conditions are always going to exist. It depends on how they interact to see if we're going to have a year like we did last year.
Right, and one of the key things that I look at if I'm thinking it's going to be a bad year for example, cyanobacterial blooms in Lake Okeechobee, I look at the rainfall we get in early spring, like right now till about May. If we see heavy rainfall, which is, think about what rain does, it causes water runoff, which carries nutrients into our watersheds and our waterways. That's going to fertilize them and help them grow. If we have heavy rain during this time of the year, I would predict that it would be, you know, a pretty severe season for harmful algal blooms.
Talk about work you're doing. You've developed and are developing a Center for Coastal and Human Health that looks to tie in all the health aspects that we've talked about of the algal blooms, other factors. Talk about that. Begin to tie in the work you all are doing proactively at FAU Harbor Branch to be part and parcel of leading where we're going in terms of the understanding of these issues and tackling them.
Sure. So we started the Florida Center for Coastal and Human Health last August in 2018. It was started with a very generous donation from the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute Foundation. And what we want to do through this center is start to aggregate all the research we're doing on harmful algal blooms. We want to look at it from what are the causes, what are the environmental drivers, how are these blooms affecting the environment, how are their toxins getting up into the food chain, and ultimately, how are their toxins affecting humans? How are they affecting us? And that critical research we need to know what the risk is to our human population.
Put us inside the command center of that kind of effort, how your teams are fanning out, where they're going, what they're doing, to begin to continue, I should say, bring in the raw data that helps lead to that kind of research, that kind of data, that kind of understanding.
Well, right now the center probably has about half of Harbor Branch's faculty working on it. So it is anywhere from people that do biomedical research, epidemiology research, people that study sharks and fish, people that study algae directly, people that study the physics and how water moves, people that study nutrient chemistry. You start to imagine how many different professors and researchers are required to do this kind of work. But not only is it Harbor Branch, one of my particular jobs is to go out and find public stakeholders and other science stakeholders, because there's other people in the state who are doing great research on harmful algae right now. We need to work together. We have very limited resources to carry this out. The more we can combine our work and not duplicate our effort, the better our results are going to be.
Talk about resource challenges in the last, and I'm not here to have you have a political discussion today, but I certainly have plenty of them on this broadcast, and one of them with the prior administration in Florida was about money for funding for the kind of research, the environmental monitoring we need. Generally speaking, are you all being starved of public funding? Do you feel it's barely adequate? Where would you put it on the scale? And what does that portend, not just for FAU Harbor Branch, but as you talked about this collegiality, what's it portend for doing the kind of research we need to do without one arm tied behind your back?
Well, I mean, science is almost always critically underfunded. I mean, that's just the way it is, and it has been for many, many years. So it's difficult both on the federal, state, and local level to get adequate funds to do what we need to do. So we need to be as good as we are at just using what limited funding we have. I do believe that the state is taking a pretty proactive position right now of trying to put money into water quality research.
We've seen that with the DeSantis administration.
Right, and I am pretty happy with how it looks like the state's going to go. The federal government as well has stepped up. They've realized that the harmful algal bloom problem is becoming a nationwide issue. It's not just Florida. And they have recently put several $1 million into harmful algal bloom research for researchers to go after. So I am somewhat encouraged that the research climate looks like it's getting better for doing this kind of work, but we can always use more.
And all of us as constituents, as people who live on the waterways or around them and who claim this, as we call it, a piece of paradise, need to be putting our fist on the table about the need for that kind of broad, objective, scientific research to give us answers, because it all relates ultimately to our health at the end of the day.
It does, and I say that all the time when I talk to people in public, is that the kind of pressure that needs to be put on politicians and people that have influence over this kind of money and where it goes is really important for the public to get involved.
I think we have some footage. I recently had a chance to go out with a crew from Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute on the Indian River Lagoon, where you all study dolphins. It's part and parcel of your work. And it was interesting to me, dolphins so beloved, but also, again, a barometer as we wrap up our first segment about what their health says about human health. They were seen higher, much higher than normal. In fact, as high as they'd seen anywhere in the world, concentrations of mercury in some dolphins in the northern tier of the lagoon, and the south, skin lesions and the like. So really, it's this kind of study that goes to the heart of not only what it says about animal health, which so many of us care about, but what it says for us. Talk about that mosaic as you bring together what you see there with all of us.
Studying dolphins is important from this point of view. I mean, obviously they're an animal most of us care about, but they're also what we call a sentinel species. They're a marine mammal. They eat some of the same fish that we do. They're in water that we recreate in. If we start to see disease or toxins in dolphins, that is a warning to scientists that we better start looking at humans, because humans share the same environment and eat some of the same food. That's a warning to us. It's like a canary in a coal mine.
And what's the warning right now?
We're seeing increased toxins in dolphins. We do see harmful algal bloom toxins in dolphins as well. So that tells us we got to do the research that we're trying to do through our new center. We have to start assessing how much of it is actually getting into our human populations.
Final thought in just this first segment we're going to continue with you after the break, but have you ever felt there was a more critical time for the kind of research the FAU harbor branches of the world are doing, given a lot of the things you're talking about?
No, this is a crisis right now.
And you don't toss around the word crisis very easily. You've said that a number of times, though.
It is a crisis, and it's not just in Florida. It is nationwide, and it's worldwide. Harmful algal blooms are becoming a worldwide problem because humans are fertilizing the oceans. I mean, this is not unique to Florida.
And the feedback loop for our health and some of the potentialities you talked about at the top of the broadcast, all things that are very real and we have to look at in the most profound way.
Yes, yes.
Thank you for your perspective, and we're going to talk to you much more about some of the other work that you were doing, dig a little deeper about FAU Harbor Branch itself. I know you've got your plate full at all times, but stay with us at home. We'll be back in just a moment. The impacts of climate change on our waterways, that and much more when we come back. Welcome back. I'm with our special guest today as we focus on protecting paradise, part of our year-long series, and with me the Executive Director of FAU Harbor Branch's Oceanographic Institute, Jim Sullivan, as we talk about our oceans, our waterways, Lake Okeechobee, all of it literally and figuratively at the heart of our lives, our economy, the environment, human health, wildlife health, and the like. We thank you for being our guest today so much. Want to switch topics a little bit. We talked about algae, coral reefs, so important. And I know it's one of several big focuses you have about coral reef health. Sometimes they've been referred to as the medicine of the sea, that what they can provide, or the opportunities there, and yet we're killing our reefs at an alarming rate. Talk about the concerns, talk about the research, talk about where you're going at FAU Harbor Branch.
So as you mentioned, coral reefs are one of the most biodiverse ecosystems that we have in the oceans. So that means biodiversity means there's a lot of different species that live there. That's very much like tropical rainforests that have a high diversity. And similar to what we do in tropical rainforests with trying to do drug discovery, we do the same thing off coral reefs with some of the animals that inhabit there. So they're a source of actual drugs, and that's where marine drugs are developed using biomedical research. However, right now, coral reefs worldwide are suffering because of climate change, warming water. They have a very narrow temperature range they can live in. But in Florida specifically, we have a new coral disease that's affecting most of our stony coral. Not all of them, but a good number of the species and some of the classic species that divers are used to here, like brain coral that you'd see in the Keys. The disease started around 2014, if I remember, right around the Miami area, and it has now spread throughout almost the entire Florida reef tract. It's gone all the way up to the northern extent of our reef tract, and it's now down into the lower Keys, and I've heard the disease has now been seen off Key West.
And do we know ultimately sources and causes of that? And is it something we can stop in its tracks and reverse the horrible damage that we're seeing? We recently did some special reports on this with my colleague Jay Cashmere. It's unbelievable.
It is. I've heard estimates that 35% of the coral have been lost, which is a very large number. For the certain species that are affected, it's probably much higher than that. There are researchers trying to figure out a cure, but honestly, right now, science doesn't even know what's causing the disease.
But it's part and parcel of what FAU Harbor Branch is doing in terms of its research effort.
Yes, we are involved in trying to understand what the disease is, how we can treat the disease, potentially with antibiotics, how we can potentially rescue some of the coral and keep them almost as an ark, that we go and find these species that are being devastated in nature, keep them alive in the lab, and if the disease burns itself out, we can reintroduce them to the environment.
But whatever the reasons, by nature and or man-made, as we look at the ongoing issues with climate change, we may very well be killing the cures that could save many of us in the future as we get rid of our coral reefs.
That is exactly it. If we lose the biodiversity in these reefs, who knows what drugs we may lose.
Talk about climate change. It's such a contentious issue. Whenever I bring it up, I'll get comments from the broadcast, but we see problems with rising sea level. We see this polarized debate, and yet we're seeing scientists say that it is a growing issue. We're seeing it in terms of king tides that are much bigger than they used to be. What kind of research are you doing on the climate change topic, and talk about its impacts to our region, our community?
Again, like the harmful algal bloom issue, Florida is on the front lines of climate change. So we are seeing tropicalization, where the climate zone is starting to spread throughout Florida. Instead of it being subtropical, it's becoming tropical. But bigger than that, one of the major results of climate change is sea level rise. This is an obvious thing. Well, most of Florida is not that high above sea level. So even a change of a foot in sea level is going to start to inundate and flood coastal areas.
And we've already seen issues to the south. I remember in Hollywood and Broward County, saltwater intrusion in wells has become a growing issue. We're certainly seeing issues. Miami Beach has made national news by some of the tremendously expensive efforts that are needed to fight sea level rise. We look at the multi-billion-dollar coastal development we have here. All of it is part of a near future of real consideration.
Right now, the projection, and this is a very conservative projection for sea level rise, by 2100, we're looking at probably 3 feet of sea level rise. 3 feet of sea level in Florida is going to be devastating. Miami will be underwater. That's within the lifetime of people being born right now. This is not in
Our
the
children
far,
and grandchildren.
this is not in the far, far future.
And again, people sometimes say, we feel helpless to stop an issue, a problem that big. What do we all need to be doing and thinking about? And then tie it into FAU Harbor Branch itself. You all have a growing role that I've read a lot about, but kind of bring it home, the issues we need to think about, and FAU's continuing growing muscular role in that. Brag a little about what you're doing there.
Well, the population needs to be thinking about is, again, it's like harmful algal blooms. You need to pressure your representatives, you need to pressure your politicians to take action and do something about it. It's not too late, and the United States has got to act. The rest of the world we need to as well.
Whether that's pollution, carbon resources, fuel sources, how we get off of our carbon fix for the last century or so.
Yep. And promoting solar, alternative energies. I mean, these are all viable ways of potentially stopping CO2.
Close on a note, we use FAU Harbor Branch as shorthand as well because you're so well known. Give us a slightly deeper dive in our remaining moments about FAU Harbor Branch, what it's about, how it's growing, and its stature, and where you're going next.
Harbor Branch right now is in a really good growth period. There's been an investment by FAU proper into Harbor Branch to hire more faculty. We're starting to expand the kind of science we can do. With more faculty comes better expertise, and it allows us to reach out into what we can do. Currently, we're looking at getting a couple major federal appropriations to do defense research and also start developing aquaculture technology and research, which is huge for Florida. We don't, and in the United States in general, we don't do as good a job as the rest of the world in aquaculture, yet 50% of our food comes from aquaculture. The United States needs to catch up. We're trying to lead that effort at Harbor Branch, as well as developing new technologies for our military. We're working on, right now, a center for persistent maritime surveillance and developing new non-acoustic techniques that the Navy can use to look at threats.
That are safe for mammals.
Right. So the Navy traditionally uses acoustic techniques, which can harm marine mammals. We're looking at non-acoustic ways of doing the same kind of surveillance.
Gives them what they need, protects the animals. That is part of your charter, really.
And it's it's also new technology and may give us an edge.
I would imagine at the end of the day for you, if you can put information in the public sphere that helps engender the public debate that leads to the kind of discussions we need to have publicly, politically, you feel like you've had a good day's work.
Yes, I do. If you can do that, and it's a big part of my job, I need to represent Harbor Branch and FAU in everything we do.
Mr. Sullivan, Executive Director of FAU Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We'll be back in just a moment. I want to thank our special guest today, Jim Sullivan, Executive Director of FAU Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute. This is such a vitally important topic, protecting our paradise, and we'll be talking with him and others about it throughout the year and beyond. And thank you for spending time with us on today's To The Point. If you'd like to send a comment about the broadcast, go to WPTV.com, click on the To The Point page, and you'll have a section to send us your views. As always, wishing you and yours a great day and a great week.